21st. So, such an integrated understanding, I think, is supplied, or a large contribution towards it is supplied by the work of George Lakoff and Mark Johnson, who George Lakoff is a linguist primarily, or cognitive scientist, working in California. Mark Johnson is a philosopher, but they've worked together now for at least a couple of decades, or maybe getting on for 30 years or something like that. But and written books individually and separate and together about meaning. And indeed, so they've hugely challenged the existing sort of academic consensus on meaning, which separated cognitive and emotive versions of it. So that account of meaning is embodied. So it's based on our physical experience. They support it with evidence from neuroscience, so they can link it in to observable brain events through brain scanning of various types. They can also link it to linguistic theory, again, which is based on observations, like prototype theory, for example, and to psychology. So, yeah, there's an evidence base here, but more than anything else, I don't think any piece of evidence is conclusive, because it always depends on how you interpret it and the model you use. So their crucial contribution, I think, is to offer a new model to explain this evidence, which also, that model, I think, also has important implications, some of which I don't think Lakoff and Johnson themselves fully recognise, but that's kind of that's part of actually a discussion I'd like to have with them myself at some point, if I can manage it. Anyway, so their account of meaning is that if we go back to the earliest infancy, this is one way into it. So if you think about the experience of a newly born baby, as far as we can tell, it's pretty chaotic. It's a lot of disordered impressions, or a jumble of things hitting the senses, which haven't really learned to order what's coming in. Though there may be some basic patterns which are genetically ingrained, like identifying the mother, the nipple, or whatever. But there's basically a lot of things that they don't understand. So as the baby learns, it does so through correlating the inputs from different senses. So what Mark Johnson calls cross-modal correlations between the senses. And then there's also correlations between the senses and movements. So the baby has to learn, if it reaches out its arm, then it can touch something new, and it can have a new set of sensations, and recognise that there'll be a certain consistency to those sensations. So this particular object there could be touched one moment, and then maybe a bit later it can come back and touch the same objects. And so making sense of the world in that sort of way is about establishing correlations. So babies start to do that long before they start to use words. But Lakoff and Johnson's case is that our words link with those kinds of correlations, so we create neural connections in our brains through, and obviously there's some sort of genetic basis for this, but it's primarily through experience that creates the neural connections, which create a basis which we can then link with the symbols that we learn subsequently. So basically, meaning is formed as neural connections in our brains that link stimuli to responses of some kind, which is why you could track sort of the roots of meaning back to quite primitive organisms, because obviously they have stimuli and they have responses to those stimuli, and it's the patterns, the linking between the stimuli and the response. That's the foundational thing.
So when you're saying you can track meaning back to quite primitive organisms, what are you saying by that? That primitive organisms have a sense of meaning in a very crude sense?
In a very crude sense, yeah.
Or are you saying something more than that? Or?
Well, it's I think there's a principle of continuity here, which I think is quite a useful one. That an explanation of our experience as human beings. Obviously there were kinds of experiences as human beings that wouldn't be shared with primitive organisms, but if we can see what the links are, if we can see how a sort of basic version of what happens to an amoeba is in some sense happening to us, we're not making the kind of left hemisphere mistake of building a completely separate cognitive model of how we are, which is disengaged from our physical roots. Yeah. So John Dewey, the philosopher, talked about this principle of continuity, and Mark Johnson uses it too. The idea that obviously, although we can't explain the whole of our experience by reference to amoebas, of course, but nevertheless, there's if we can track continuity, that's sort of a reassurance that there's a consistency there in the way that we're understanding meaning in this case.
So a kind of continuity in the way that meaning is constructed from simpler ideas.
That's right.
Yeah.
So if meaning is basically comes down to stimulus response, obviously the form that stimulus and response takes and the kind of links that exist between them is far more complex for us than for primitive organisms, but there's still that similarity of pattern. But then the other key point here, which Johnson makes, is that the form of these connections is shaped by our organic needs and desires. So this is where the connection to desire comes in. I think that why is it that we build up ideas, as it were, in our minds of some things rather than others? Why do those things matter to us? Why is the baby attracted by the soft toy hanging above its cot or whatever? Well, it's obviously there are organic needs and desires that baby has, or needs for stimulation of various kinds. Some things will attract it more than others, so brightly coloured things, for example, might attract it more than things that aren't brightly coloured. This kind of linkage depends on our desires in the end. It depends on a sort of a habit of being stimulated, if you like, by a particular experience of some sort of object. So if the baby sees a big red toy, it's stimulated by the big red toy, and it gets the idea red, and then red for that baby means the red toy, and it's got an association. It's beginning to get a symbol. It's beginning to get the use of the meaning of that symbol. It wouldn't have that sense of meaning if red didn't strike it in a particular way. If it couldn't sense red, for example, that would be a basic example, wouldn't it? But if it didn't have colour vision, it wouldn't be able to come up with that meaning. But also, if it was indifferent to red, if it didn't have some sort of purpose in the life of the baby, if it wasn't helping it adapt to its environment in some way to respond to this red object. So the way in which Lakoff and Johnson then explain how we get meaningful words from this sort of basic experience that you get in a baby. So firstly, image schemas and basic level categories, which are the way in which we come to understand concrete words or concrete symbols. So what he means by image schemas is sort of frequent physical experiences we have, which we relate to meanings of some kind. So he talks about the container schema, for example, which is a very widely used and important one. So we get the sense from early infancy of in and out, things being inside other things and outside other things, and our bodies are perhaps the first way we relate to that, so in and out. And then that container schema can then be obviously used to understand in and out of a box, or it can be used to understand the very idea of a box, for that matter.
Yeah.
Can then be used later on to understand the idea of a mathematical set. Yeah. And then the other kind of basic experience which Lakoff talks about is basic level category. So this is where we encounter objects in our experience, and we obviously have certain kinds of sense experiences, fairly consistent sense experiences, which go with that object, which make us say cat, jug, whatever it is. Yeah. But there's a sense of practical level at which we first encounter those objects, which then sticks with us in a more basic way. So tree, for example, for most people would be, particularly people brought up in a town, would be a basic level category. And then later on, as our understanding becomes more complex, we begin to differentiate rowan, oak, sycamore, etc. Yeah, but we'd only understand what a sycamore is because we've already got the basic level category of a tree,
yeah,
on which to branch out, as it were. So see, to some extent, Lakoff argues that our basic level categories depend on our context and our culture. So perhaps if you're a country dweller who's very intimate with trees from early infancy, maybe oak is a basic level category rather than tree. It depends on the situation. Anyway, so once we've got basic level categories in our image schemas, we can then actually develop extremely abstract concepts through metaphorical extension. So all we do with metaphorical extension is map this abstract idea to the image schema. So I've already mentioned one example of how do you understand the concept of a mathematical set? Well, it's like a container. So when we have this abstract idea that we discover in a mathematics lesson, Lakoff is arguing, well, that's only meaningful to us because there is this basic physical recognition of what in means, for example, and the container schema going on. So that means that when the mathematician is engaged in a complex abstract calculation involving sets, nevertheless, even in that kind of case, that mathematician is still dependent on their basic bodily experience, with the meaning of what they're doing. So there's a whole load of mappings of metaphors, and Mark Johnson particularly has done a lot of work on the range of metaphors. Well, there's a book called Metaphors We Live By, where he gives a whole list, a great range of metaphors. But when you start looking at our language, a lot of our language consists of dead metaphors, where we've forgotten the fact that they're metaphors in a sense. So if you think about grasping an idea, for example, that's obviously related to physical grasping. It's a metaphorical extension of an image schema of grasping. Or obviously we've been talking this week about the middle way. Middle way is itself a metaphor, and the idea of a way in this metaphorical sense is based on our basic experience of traversing space, following a path.
So very much fits with subjective experience, at least for me anyway. I mean, just thinking about maths at school, I really struggled with maths until we started doing geometry in when I was about 12 or 13. Suddenly I managed to start getting things because I had this kind of spatial, pictorial understanding of the maths, and then it started to actually mean something.
Right.
Whereas up to that point, it was just gobbledygook to me.
Yeah.
And after that, I was fine.
Yeah.
It's almost like I had the foundation on which to build.
Interesting.
Yeah, I mean that's why if people don't grasp something when you're teaching it to them, you give them an analogy, try and find another way into it.
Sort of sounds similar to and you were talking about the landscapes of something the other day, and like we can imagine if you describe something 2-dimensional, I can think of that, and then 3-dimensional. But as soon as someone says 4-dimensional, you just can't. And I think so. Most people have trouble thinking in 4 dimensions, and also with time and space. Thinking of space as infinite, we just can't think of it because we can't visualize it. There's no, what did you call it, image schema for it. So the head just kind of goes, nope.
And yet, curiously, it's maybe not possible to visualize it, and yet you can use that metaphorical extension so that you can actually reasonably talk about 6, 7, 8 dimensional space, and you kind of got a sense of what it means even though you can't visualize it.
I struggle.
But yes, it does. The metaphor gets increasingly stretched, and it gets increasingly left brain and dead in effect, because you can't, if you can't relate it in a very live way to your bodily experience, you become more and more dependent just on the left hemisphere's construction alone. But nevertheless, you're still, it wouldn't mean anything at all if there wasn't this linked body experience somewhere.
And also, maybe you have a metaphor for infinity or the 4th dimension, in the sense that you have that awkward feeling, and other people have that, so you do have that commonality there, in a sense.
Yeah. Okay, so to go on then, so when we use a particular image schema to understand something through metaphor, that schema forms a cognitive model. So we have a kind of representation going on, if you like, in our left hemisphere, which has a certain logic in which things work in a certain way, need to relate in a certain way. So if we go back to the example of containers and mathematical sets, for example, that you can make a logical deduction just based on containers, in effect. So supposing you've got, objects A and B, which are inside C, and you've got C and D are inside E, then we can deduce that A is inside E. And that, but you could do that with bricks in boxes. You could do that in a very physical way with containers, just as you could through logic. So if we take this kind of view of meaning offered by Lakoff and Johnson, then meaning is not limited to language, and I think this is one of the crucial implications. So previously, analytic philosophers and analytic linguists would say basically that language is where meaning is, and they would struggle to ascribe any meaning, or they'd find very circuitous ways of ascribing meaning to, say, music or art. But there's no problem with that in this embodied view of meaning. It becomes clear that art and music mean something to us because they impact on our bodily experience. So they relate to image schemas, they may relate to metaphorical constructions as well, but they certainly have a direct impact on us, which then becomes associated, which then becomes symbolic. So if you take this sort of Lakoff-Johnson approach, it unifies cognitive animated meaning. It shows the constant interaction of the hemispheres, and as I was saying earlier about the role of desire here, that it links meaning with desire, or it shows how sort of a quantum of desire is required to be attached to each symbol that is meaningful to us in order for it to be so.